All right, let's take our Bibles, please, at this time and turn back to Daniel chapter 7 once again. And remember that the book of Daniel is naturally divided into two halves. The first 6 chapters dealing with the narrative, or really the events of Daniel's life after he's carried into Babylonian captivity. And then the last 7 chapters, starting with this 6th chapter, starting with chapter 7, describe some visions that Daniel is having. And this first one here is really weird, I guess that would best describe it. I called it, the past service, Monsters in My Bedroom. Monsters in My Bedroom. I remember probably 20 years ago, there was I call it a computerized cartoon, whatever they are, but one of those came out, and it was about these monsters that showed up in the bedrooms of little kids. And I watched it and smiled because there was a little girl in it, and at the time, she looked so much like my dimpled darling, my youngest daughter, my little brunette daughter at the time. But I've never forgotten that whole concept. It's kind of a cliche that we have, that there's monsters in my bedroom, or there's monsters under my bed. Well, we find here that Daniel goes to bed, and he has a nightmare, if you want to call it that. We saw in verse number 1 of chapter 7, he had a dream and the visions of his head upon his bed. And so he's in his bedroom, he's seeing some things, but this isn't a nightmare. This is actually something God has given to him. This is the future of the world. This is the time of the Gentiles playing out. And so today we're going to see it beginning in verse number 2. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea. And the 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, the second, like to a bear. And it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night vision, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue at the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So who are these beasts? Well, before we get into it, we have a little bit of unfinished business. I mentioned the other night that from verse number 8 on here of chapter 7, it turns to Aramaic in the language, but that's actually verse 28, the end of the chapter. So you've got this different language from chapter 2 through this chapter, because this is a vision for the Gentiles, the non-Jews, the Gentile nations. And also, by way of review, this all goes back to about 606 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar came and he took Daniel and his 3 friends captive back to Jerusalem, and this 70-year captivity began. The Jews owed God 70 Sabbaths because for 490 years they had not let the land rest every 7th year. And so God started his watch ticking in 606 BC. It didn't change the heart of the Jews. They kept the rebellion up, and finally in 587, 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar just leveled the temple and everything in Jerusalem. And now the year is about 540 BC. Daniel's been there for 60-some years, and he has a vision. He has a vision. Now, I want to preface that by saying, don't seek visions today. There are those who look for visions. Jesus said, a wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after a vision. We've got something far better than that. And so don't go seeking visions. Now, I'm not saying God can't use premonitions perhaps in our heart. And I know some pretty strange stories of believers who've gotten some kind of an inkling that's something coming. And maybe God has given that. But that's the shallowest form of revelation from God. The deepest form of revelation from God is this book you hold in your hands right here. And I count it a real privilege that God has told us the future in the Bible. This is something that we can know. He doesn't play hide and seek with the future. God is continually trying to get his truth to us. He wants us to dig it out of there. Most people ignore it. But Christians have the privilege of seeing what lies ahead. You've got people in this world, they're in a fog. They don't know what's going on. And with recent activities, they're wringing their hands and they're wondering, well, we know that God is has pulled back the curtain for us as his people to know these things. We don't have to be in the fog like the world. I got a phone call from somebody today, and they want to have Bible study. They said, I can't ignore it anymore. I'm seeing what's going on, and I just can't ignore it. And there's something to this, and I haven't been to church for years. He said, but I want to get back in church. Well, God's pulling back the curtain here in the Bible and in the book of Daniel for us as saints to look into this. That's the benefit of being born again. We can know what's coming down the road. And so here God is describing the future destiny of the world at that time and for our time as well. It's known as the time of the Gentiles. And here in chapter 7, it gets prophetic. Daniel's going to receive 4 visions. He receives a vision here in chapter 7. He receives a vision in the next chapter, chapter 8. He receives another one in chapter 9. And then in chapters 10, 11, and 12, the rest of the book, he receives the last vision. And these visions are at different times while he was there in Babylonian captivity. They're in different places. They're under different kings. So here in chapter 7, it all begins. And Daniel, one night, puts on his sleeping gown, and he puts on his little nightcap and tucks his hair into this. And here's the prophet who goes to bed, and all of a sudden, boing, he's awakened during the night, and he has this vision. It's a vision of a lion, of a bear, of a leopard, and even of this nondescript beast who's so beyond description, Daniel really can't put it into words. But these are 4 different kingdoms. These are 4 future kingdoms. And I said the other day, this is actually a repeat of chapter 2. And you say, well, why does God repeat himself? I mentioned in chapter 2, the vision there was Nebuchadnezzar's, a Gentile heathen king. He sees this statue 90 feet tall, and the heads of gold, and the arms and the chest are of silver, the belly, the thighs of brass, and the legs of iron. And we know that that's a depiction of 4 future empires, starting with the Babylonian Empire, which would be conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire, which would be conquered by the Grecian Empire, which would be conquered by the Roman Empire, which really wasn't conquered. It just imploded morally, and it's going to be revived. It's going to kind of make up a 5th kingdom, but the final kingdom is going to be the Ancient of Days, the Lord Jesus Christ, to rule and reign. So in chapter 2, it's this image of gold and silver, and that's man's perspective of world kingdoms. But here in chapter 7, we find a divine view of world kingdoms. And God views fighting, raging, warring, whoremongering humanity as beasts, monsters, as animals. Man paints a rosy picture. God looks down and he sees these ravenous, devouring beasts. And to him, that's how mankind acts, and that is how we act. That is our behavior and our culture. And I've often said there's war in the world because there's war in the heart. There's fighting between spouses. There's fighting between siblings. There's fighting between churches even. And we can try and say, well, we're good by nature, but we're really not. We might try and look good on the outside. There might be these fleeting moments where we have our goodness, and maybe a farmer breaks his leg and his neighbors come and they put his crop in, and we say, that's just mankind, it's basically good. But we're deleting all the stubbornness, the normal selfishness, the pride, the gossip, the lust, and all these other qualities that Christ had come out of the heart of man. And since the beginning of time, we've had our Genghis Khans, and we've had our Charlemagnes, and we've had these Germanic lords, and these barbarians, and these Huns, and these Vikings, and these Goths, and these Muslims, and these Eastern empires, and all they want is power and land and money, and we cannot live and let live, or give peace a chance, as somebody said. No, there's always fighting. It's always been that way, because there's war in the human heart. So don't let outward appearances deceive us here. God, in chapter 7 here, shows us how he views humanity. Let's take a look at it here. We see, first of all, what I call the darkness. Now, there's 4 kingdoms here. 4 kingdoms mentioned: the Gentile history, the time of the Gentiles. They're beast-like. And outside of Jesus Christ, there is no light. He is the light. We know that. And so it starts out, Daniel says in verse 2, Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision, notice, by night. God could have showed him this in the daytime, high noon, But no, it's in the night. This is significant. This pictures something. This pictures the blackness of humanity that this whole thing's going to come up out of. It's a picture of human history. It's a dark one. It's a dark one. You know, in the earlier days, in the UK, for example, there was revivals. There was great revivals in Wales. There were great revivals in Scotland. There was great revivals in England. Those are long gone. They are so dark over there. I've been out to the Northeast here recently, and they're celebrating tricentennials out there. We're having our centennials here. They started earlier than us, and the darkness is greater. You can't miss it. It's just a darkness. There was a time in America when there was a reverence for God, and people were church-going and God-fearing. Not today. There's this pattern that is following here. There's a darkness of the mind. There's a darkness of the heart. There's a darkness of the soul. There are so few people left that really care about God. I've been having Bible study for the last couple of weeks with not one but 2 PhDs. That's interesting. I had it earlier today, 2 PhDs. It helps that I have a PhD, though. I keep it in my garage. It's my posthole digger. It's a beauty. But anyway, these two, and you wouldn't guess this, but they are so tenderhearted. They are so hungry for truth, and it is so refreshing because it is so rare. Nobody cares about God anymore. Have you noticed that? It's getting worse. Most of this world is enshrouded in darkness. Darkness. But at the same time, it's bright in heaven. We have nothing to worry about. God's still on the throne. And so Daniel at first, he says in verse 2, I saw in my vision, notice, by night. By night. We see the darkness. But secondly, we see the disturbance. In verse 2, he said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea. That word strove means they to strive with. He sees these 4 winds. These 4 winds are symbolic of something just like the darkness is. These 4 winds are symbolic of tempestuous powers, stirred up nations that are shaking fists in God's face and defying God. And they're stirred up. These 4 winds are stirring things up. You know, Proverbs says that hatred stirreth up strifes. There's something in the Bible about a stirring up. And anyone can get stirred up. Nations can get stirred up as well. And so here we find these winds of opposition. They are blowing and they are stirring things up and they are resisting truth. You ever worked against the wind? Have you ever built a home in the wind? Have you ever picked up a 4x8 piece of plywood or OSB in the wind and tried to carry it when the wind is blowing 25, 30 miles an hour? You become a kite, a human kite. There's something about working in the wind that by the end of the day, you're just worn out. It's called resistance. The wind speaks of a resistance, and the work of God is continually being resisted. There is spiritual warfare. There is resistance taking place. And I'm telling you, if you're in the ministry, by the end of the day, you don't have anything left. Because of that resistance, you'd have had more energy if you dug a ditch all day long. There is a spiritual resistance. My pastor used to say that the building of a New Testament church was like hewing out a rock, and how true that is. Because the devil fights you every single inch of the way. So we find here this wind stirring things up. You know, the Bible mentions the noble Bereans in Acts chapter 17 who were searching the scriptures daily. Remember that? They were tender, they were teachable, they were having Bible studies. This thing was spreading, revival was taking place. But guess who shows up? The devil. And we read in Acts 17:13 that when the Jews of Thessalonica had knowledge that the word of God was preached to Paul at Berea, they came thither also and stirred up the people. That's the same thing, these winds of resistance, stirring things up, opposing, resisting the work of God. And if you try and do anything for God, just mark it down. It won't be without resistance. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it. But it's not easy, and everybody's not doing it because the devil hates it. There's a force at work, and Satan is doing everything in his power, like those winds, to push back the work of God. So we see the darkness, and we see the disturbance, but thirdly, we see the domain. Where is this taking place? Well, in verse 2 again, Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heavens strove, notice where, upon the great sea. What's this great sea? You say, well, that region of the world, maybe the Mediterranean. No, it's not the Mediterranean Sea. It's not the Black Sea. It's not the Aegean Sea. It's not the Red Sea. It's not the Dead Sea. It's really not a literal sea. Not at all. I don't think, at least. I think it's talking about a sea of humanity. I'll show you why in just a moment. But we talk about a sea of faces, a sea of humanity. And here we have in the dark these winds stirring this sea up, this sea of humanity, and it's a picture of this chaotic civilization, this unorganized, chaotic, restless, unstable sea. You know, there are few things as unstable as water. Remember when Jacob was telling the future of his 12 sons there as Genesis is wrapping up? He gets to the one Reuben who had defiled his concubine, and he says, Reuben, thou art my firstborn, unstable as water. Thou shalt not excel because thou wentest up to thy father's bed. Unstable as water. Water is very unstable. We find this sea is all stirred up, and this sea is pictured as unstable. This great sea is chaotic, it's confused, it's restless. And the Bible pictures the restless sea of humanity like that in a number of places. Let me show you a few. In Isaiah 17, it says, woe to the multitude of many people, which make a noise like the noise of the sea, and to notice the rushing of nations that make a rushing like the rushing of many waters. God here is comparing chaotic mankind and societies and cultures and nations that are all confused and restless and something like water that is stirred up. And as you compare Scripture with Scripture, you can't miss it. This is a picture, this great sea is a picture of the massive humanity that these four empires are going to rise up out of. In Revelation 13, we find something future. John the Revelator says, and I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up, where? Out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Here we find the Antichrist. And where does he come out of? He rises up out of this restless sea of humanity. We find also in chapter 17, and he saith unto me, the waters which thou sawest where the horse sitteth are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. Here we find this religious system rise up again out of the restless sea. And you don't have to wonder what the sea is. God tells us, the waters which thou sawest where the horse sitteth are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. It's a mass of people, but more than that, it's a mass of confused people. It's people living in confusion, and that's people today. We have this restless sea of people, and they don't know where they come from. They don't know why we're here. They don't know where they're going when this thing's over. And they have this herd instinct, and it's the blind leading the blind, and it's a mess. Everybody's fallen in the ditch. So in Daniel 7, we find these winds blowing, stirring up the sea of humanity, making it restless. But who's behind all this? Well, we know who's behind all this. In Ephesians 6, the Bible reminds us that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. It's not about people, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. This is talking about the devil and his demons and his domain, basically. This world is his. He's the prince of the power of the air. And he's continually stirring things up. And he has been doing that for millenniums. And as Daniel's getting these 4 visions here of these 4 animals here, it's the devil behind it all. One following the other, following the other. Now, we've seen the darkness. We've seen the wind. We've seen the sea. Now let's look at the vision itself. In verse number 3, it mentions, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. These are future empires. These are future nations. These are future kings, different one from the other, rising up out of the sea. Well, we find out there's going to be this fourth one that's so terrible that he's nondescript, he's beyond words, that is going to go out of existence for a while, and Rome has. But the Roman Empire is going to be revived, and it has something to do with those 7 heads and 10 horns. We'll talk about that later. But out of that, there's going to come this final world ruler before the Ancient of Days rules with a rod of iron, and that final world ruler is going to be known as the Antichrist. In Revelation chapter 13 again, John says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea." Now we're talking about beasts, aren't we? Monsters and animals. Here's the ultimate one. It says, "And they worshiped the dragon," that's the devil, "which gave power unto the beast," that's the Antichrist. "And they worshiped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast?" Now, there have been some nasty rulers, and we've talked about Nebuchadnezzar. We've talked about Alexander the Great and the Medo-Persian Empire and some of these guys. We're going to be looking at Antiochus Epiphanes. And of course, the Neros and the Caesars were awful, and they certainly were beast-like. But the ultimate beast, and he may be alive right now and somewhere in the world, we don't know, but he's going to rise to power, and he's going to make Hitler look like a choir boy. You know, I've been to Auschwitz. I've seen the gas chambers. I've seen the laboratories where they did their experiments. I've seen the incinerators where they burned them. I've seen the fields where they put the charred bones. I've seen that, and it was awful. And you say to yourself, what monster could do this? Well, the Antichrist is going to make Hitler look like a choir boy. By the time he's done, he's going to be a beast. He's going to be the pinnacle of beast-like behavior, according to the Bible. So Daniel sees 4 beasts. And they arise out of this mass, restless sea of dark humanity, and they're all predators. They all want more land. They all want more power. They all want more glory. They can only think of conquering. You know that when Alexander conquered the then known world, he went back to Babylon and he sat down and he wept. You say, well, why? He's king of the world. He wept because there were no more worlds to conquer, no more nations to conquer. That was what he lived for. So who are these 4 beasts? Well, in verse 17 of this chapter, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little, but it says, "These great beasts, which are 4 kings which shall arise out of the earth." This is the time of the Gentiles. We're going to take it apart, but they're pictured as beast. We see the darkness, the disturbance, we see their domain, but finally we see the definition of this all. What's this all about here? Well, let's start with the first one. In verse 4, it says the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Daniel said, "As I beheld, till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man. And man's heart was given it." Now, what is this talking about? Well, this is talking about the empire of Babylon, the one that was in power at that time, because this took place in the first year of Belshazzar, right? Kind of a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And so this first beast here, I believe, is a picture of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, this lion with the wings on it. And if you study the Mesopotamian, Chaldean culture, you see these kind of funky emblems on everything here. A lion with wings. This was an obvious one to Daniel. As he saw that, all he had to do was look around Babylon, and he saw this kind of stuff at the time, and he said, okay, I know who this one is talking about. But really what Daniel is talking about here in verse number 4, it parallels Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Babylon was the head of gold. Nebuchadnezzar was the first empire there. And he was full of himself. He was intoxicated with pride, and he was bragging about his hanging gardens and all his gold and this great Babylon that I've built with my might. And all of a sudden, God turned him into a literal beast, didn't he? And for 7 years, he's out there living in the forest, waking up with the dew of the morning on him, eating like the animals out there. And finally, at the end of 7 years, he comes to himself. And then he writes something in chapter 4, and I love that chapter. We turn back there for just a moment, and we find out that it looks like Nebuchadnezzar got saved. And in verse 34, he says, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven. Well, that's something he'd never done before. And he said, mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, God that is, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And he goes on and he says, those who lift themselves up in pride, God is able to humble, take it from me. And he understood that quite well. But we find out here that I think he got saved, he got a new heart. I call it a heart operation. And the Bible talks about this in a vivid picture in the book of Ezekiel. Chapter 36, God says, a new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I will take away the stony heart, and I will give you a heart of flesh, a soft heart, a saved heart. This is what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. I believe he got saved. And back here in chapter 7, I believe that verse 4 is a picture of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. And the lion here, of course, is the empire of Babylon. And we find here it's not just any lion. In verse 4, it says it had eagle's wings. So the lion is the king of beasts, right? And the eagle is the king of the air, the king of fowl, if you want to put it that way. And so these wings on this lion are a picture of human pride, of something that lifted up Nebuchadnezzar, but he got his wings plucked. We still use that expression, don't we? We find in verse 4 here, he got his wings plucked. He lost his mind. It was the best thing that could ever happen to him. Jesus said, except you humble yourself, you should not be saved, in so many words. So Nebuchadnezzar comes to the end of himself. He'd been crawling like a beast, but now in verse 4, he stands upon his feet. He's given the heart of a man. He stopped being a beast, stopped crawling on all fours. He got born again. I believe we'll see him in heaven one day. I think he got converted, folks. Because in chapter 4, he's rejoicing and praising God because now he has this soft heart of flesh. He's a different man. He came to himself. His wings were plucked. He's not a lion anymore. Not a lion anymore. Now, what about the second one? In verse number 5, Daniel goes on, and behold, another beast, the second, like to a bear. And it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, arise and devour much flesh. Who's this? Well, hold your finger and turn back to chapter 2 again. We don't have to wonder because actually we've seen this already in chapter 2, and we're going to see it again one more time. But here in chapter 2, Daniel is talking to Nebuchadnezzar, who's had his dream, wondering, what's this image, and who's this head of gold, and so on, silver, and all that. And in verse number 39, he tells them, he says, and after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. He says, you're going to get taken down by an inferior kingdom. And of course, silver is inferior to gold, right? As far as value goes. And a bear is inferior to a lion as far as a fight goes. A lion's the king of animals. He's the king of beasts. But one thing about a bear, as you turn back to chapter 7, a bear is more ravenous and means it eats more. And the Medo-Persian Empire is this bear. And we remember that while Belshazzar was having his boozing party that night and boozing it up, the Medo-Persians came in and they conquered Babylon. And so now we find in verse 5, this bear raises itself up, has 3 ribs in its mouth, and arises to devour much flesh. You say, what's this talking about? What are the 3 ribs in his mouth? Well, he's kind of picking his teeth. He's gotten done eating already. They're actually representative of the fact that Babylon makes empire number 3. He's conquered because while that was going on, while Belshazzar was goofing around, we find the Medo-Persian Empire is conquering the world. And they had already conquered the Syrians, one of the ribs. They had already conquered the Egyptians, the second rib. And now they conquer the Babylonians, representing this 3rd rib. And they're told to arise and devour, notice, much flesh. You know, the bear out eats the lion. And the Medo-Persian Empire conquered more land than even the Babylonian Empire did. In fact, they expanded the Babylonian boundaries to include everything from the Indus River to Egypt to the Aegean Sea and beyond. It was much bigger than Babylon. So we find this bear with the ribs in its mouth devouring much flesh, a picture of the Medo-Persian Empire. And then we read on. In verse 6, we find the next one. And after this, Daniel says, I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. You say, now who's this empire? Well, we don't really have to wonder, because if you turn back to chapter 2 again, remember that image of gold and silver? Well, what was the third element? Well, in verse 39, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, and after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over the earth. Who's this kingdom of brass? Brass is inferior now to silver and inferior to gold in worth, but stronger in metal, stronger in element, inferior in wealth, but a stronger element. Who's the brass? Well, if you want to write it down, I think we're going to run out of time, but in Daniel chapter 8, we're going to see in verses 20 and 22, it's definitely Greece. Definitely the Grecian Empire. Because again, in Daniel chapter 11, verses 2 through 4, we find it's going to be driven home again. So back here in chapter 7, this leopard with the 4 wings on it and so on, this is a picture of Greece. This is a picture of Alexander the Great. The leopard is swift. The leopard is cunning. The leopard is determined. It will not back off. And Alexander the Great conquered the Medo-Persian Empire along with Greece, and he did it in record time. He was groomed in by his dad, Philip of Macedon II, and when he ascended to the throne, he put the pedal to the metal. Nobody has ever conquered the world as fast as Alexander the Great, because a leopard is speedy, and Alexander just mowed down one nation after another. He just flew from country to country, and he was unbeatable. He never lost a battle. He just won, and he won, and he won, until finally all that was left was Babylon, and he conquered Babylon. But it was there at Babylon that he wept, because he had no more worlds to conquer. And he drank from the great Herculean cup full of booze, and he got alcohol poison. And he came down sick, and he knew he was dying. And he said, before I die, I want you to know how to process my funeral through the streets of Babylon. He said, I want holes cut in the sides of my casket, and I want my hands put out the side, and I want everybody in Babylon to see my dead body paraded down the street with my empty hands and know how I left this world. He finally wised up at the end, but he died. He died depressed. And all that wine, all that women, all that song, being ruler of the world, didn't satisfy him. And there's a lesson here, folks. It never will satisfy. Now, here in verse 6, Daniel says, I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it, notice, 4 wings of a fowl, and the beast also had 4 wings. What's this 4 business? What were there 4 of? Well, when Alexander the Great died, his empire split between his 4 generals. Ptolemy, I don't remember the names of all of them here, but his 4 top generals split the kingdom in 4 different ways, and it just went downhill from there. It never regained its traction, its footing. It was easily conquered by Rome down the road, and it really just, the wheels fell off. And there's a real lesson here. Alexander went to all that work putting it together, and when he died, it just kind of evaporated and disintegrated, and he must have felt somewhat like Solomon. Solomon had this to say in Ecclesiastes. He said, therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me. Yea, I hated all my labor which I had taken under the sun. Why? Because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me, and who knoweth whether he shall be a wise man or a fool, yet shall he have rule over all my labor when I have labored, and wherein I have showed myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. So when these 4 generals took over and split the thing, it just went downhill. It was all for naught. Just all for naught. You know, it was Christ who said this. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul. That's exactly what Alexander did. And it's so sad to see people even yet today wasting their time living for the most shallow things. Jesus said this also, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. Friend, if you're currently putting your stock in this world, if you're giving this world your best, your time, your treasure, your talent, it's like straightening the deck chairs on the Titanic. You're wasting your time. It's a sinking ship. Well, that leaves us with one more kingdom, or technically two more, if you count the future one. But Daniel here also, in his kaleidoscope of these world empires here, he reveals the wicked end-time ruler that we're going to get to later. And this is what makes it relevant to us. It slides into this one that is yet to come, and this is why we study prophecy. We can learn from this. And in fact, Bible scholars and even skeptics have looked at this, and they've said this is perhaps the most overall, comprehensive, detailed description of world history. Now, we currently have meetings taking place around the world. Our president and world leaders recently were in Europe, and they're having their summit, and they're trying to fix the world's problem and largely ignoring the Word of God. And that's human power, isn't it? That's humanism, we call it. And we have this industrial strength, colossal mess in this world today because of humanism. Man saying we don't need God, we'll cast off his yoke. And we learn from Psalm 2, he that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. That means confusion. And boy, if there's ever been confusion, it's now. If there's ever been a mess, it's now. Now, next time, we're going to take a look at the devil's last stand, I might call it, and how he gets squashed like a bug, and how the Ancient of Days ascends the throne. And I just want to close by saying you can rest well tonight, knowing you don't have to worry about a thing. If there's monsters in your bedroom, don't worry about it. God is in control.